All right. All right, I know we still have people filing in, but I know we have a lot to discuss this evening, so I'd love to go ahead and get started. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Hudson Library's special virtual author event with Harvard Law professor Martha Minow, author of Saving the News, Why the Constitution Calls for Government Action to Preserve Freedom of Speech. I got the book right here. Fantastic book. Before we get started this evening, I'd like to let everyone know that tonight's event is just one of our many, many in-person and virtual events. If you like tonight's program, you may be interested in our virtual discussion with New Yorker journalist Nick Romeo on Monday at 7 p.m. He's going to be joining me again for a moderated discussion about the current state of economics and his new book, The Alternative: How to Build a Just Economy. On February 13th, we will also have journalist Jennifer Brenev Wallace, and she's going to join us for a discussion about toxic achievement culture and her new book, Never Enough. For more information about any of our programs, as well as links to register, simply visit our website, hudsonlibrary.org. Now, if you have questions tonight for Professor Minow, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. I'll be selecting questions to read towards the second half of tonight's program. Also note, copies of Saving the News are available for purchase, courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. Now, Martha Minow is the 300th anniversary University Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She has taught at Harvard Law School since 1981, where her courses include civil procedure, constitutional law, family law, fairness and privacy, international criminal justice, jurisprudence, law and education, nonprofit organizations, and the public law workshop. That is a list. An expert in human rights and advocacy for members of racial and religious minorities and women, children, and persons with disabilities. She also writes and teaches about AI, which I bet we'll talk about tonight, and legal issues, and about how societies transition from war and atrocities to regimes committed to democracy and justice. Minow served as Dean of Harvard Law School between 2009 and 2017. And was the inaugural Morgan and Helen Chu Dean and Professor. She currently is the chair of the MacArthur Foundation and a member of the governing boards of the Campaign Legal Center, the Carnegie Corporation, and Public Media GmbH. That is a resume, Martha. So please join me, everyone, in providing a warm welcome. And again, Martha, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right. Long introduction aside, I would love to get started about this book because we were talking briefly before we let everybody in tonight that, there's so many op-ed articles, people saying, having their opinions about the news, but no one has really done a deep dive and published a book about the current state of media as a whole, as well as how to fix it. So I'm curious to ask, what was it that inspired you to really do a deep dive into this topic and write a book?
I was very interested in the issues about access to reliable news. And I also noticed how many newspapers were closing. Just over the past year, 2023, it turned out almost 3,000 newspapers closed. And the rate of closure has increased. And based on the rate that it is right now, we will have another 3,000 to 4,000 close. And that means that we have many, many communities, over 200, that have no local news. And they're increasingly called news deserts. And I kind of live in one. There's no really reliable local news source. And it's a real cost. So that's what motivated me. I actually went to the library and looked for a book to explain what was going on, and I couldn't find one. So I thought I better write it.
And thank you so much for bringing up news deserts, because I really think it's one of the most pressing issues with the changes in media. that's happened in like the last 20 plus years. And we were talking beforehand how I grew up in a town, we had a weekly newspaper, we have nothing now. Except Facebook, and Facebook is not journalism. Your neighbor's telling you that there's a new restaurant opening. That is not true journalism. I have a question for you about this news desert issue. So, we have so many websites now. People blame part of the issue on like the plethora of news sites, right? Especially for national, international news. But news that like for local news, you normally only have like one, maybe two resources. So isn't there like a bit of a hypocrisy? Like, wouldn't you think there'd still be a demand for local news? What happened specifically for the destruction of local news?
It is local news that is most in jeopardy, even though it's also true that some national media are in trouble as well. And it's not just in the US. I've discovered it's issues in Nigeria, in India, issues in Europe. But I think that the big problem, it's a confluence, it's almost like a perfect storm of different causes. One for sure is the internet. And you might be surprised that one of the biggest causes of the decline of local papers is Craigslist, because ads used to be a major source of revenue for local papers that offered apartments for sale or buy my car or what have you. And that disappeared. The internet more broadly, you mentioned Facebook, other social media sites. Not only do people end up getting a lot of their information from their friends and neighbors or even strangers, but people post the excerpts or the whole content from a news source without paying for it. So what used to be a virtuous cycle of people being readers, liking what they get, paying either for a subscription or buying the products that are advertised, all that disappeared. And the social media technology companies, their leaders admit we're not in the news business. We're not journalists. And what they're in the business of is eyeballs and selling attention. And they don't really care about that virtuous news cycle, that virtuous investment in reporting and professional reporting. Another cause that's kind of curious is the rise of investors who are interested in a return. And what's fascinating is that journalism, newspapers still have a return. Subscriptions generate money. They're in the black, but it's not the double digits, triple digits that some investors want. And as a result, you have these kinds of purchasers that buy all the local news in an area, and then they strip mine them. They fire the reporters, and then they circulate the same stories across 5, 10, 20, 40 different communities, but it's not news anymore. And that's another cause of the dangers of what's going on. There are others as well. Labor costs went up, paper costs went up. But a lot of what I have seen, it's the dominant effects are the ones that I've described.
Right. And so it's an amalgamation of a whole bunch of issues, not just one. I think that's so important, especially with the solutions that you provide later on. Um, I think before we really dive into like your solutions and some of the more problems of today, it's good to also like look in the past. And I really love how in your book you take the time to look at the evolution and development of media, all the way from the printed press through telegram lines, the radio, and then even into television. And from your legal background, I'm just curious, are there one or two laws that were developed during this time that you think were the most pivotal in developing and supporting media?
Well, I love the way you put the question, because so often we as Americans are very proud of our First Amendment. I am. But it's written in the negative form, so that Congress shall make no law restricting the freedom of speech, abridging the freedom of speech. And it makes it look like there can be no government action whatsoever. And so one of the, again, reasons I wrote the book was so many people said, well, there's nothing government can do because of the First Amendment, that really sent me down that historical path to find so many different government actions that really affected the development of media and news specifically. So I think that the telegraph is such a great example. The Navy was a major purchaser, investor in the development of the telegraph. And that, of course, was a fantastic way to share information very, very quickly. The United States also, as a nation, was one of the first to develop a regulation of broadcasting. So it was radio first, then television. And in both instances, the government stepped in with the recognition that there's a scarcity problem and a kind of traffic cop was needed to deal with the airwaves and to allocate licenses so that you could hear distinctive messages and not have them all overlapping. And that led to, a pretty robust regulatory regime, including requirements of public interest, public service, requiring radio and television to carry public media, to have an educational mission. And even with the development of cable, that significantly expanded the possibilities of choice. We went from 2.5 major broadcasters, to the hundreds that we see today. Even then, the federal government says there's an obligation that the cable carrier, cable provider, make room for local coverage. Internet has nothing like that, even though, just one more, the federal government was deeply involved in the development of the internet. The federal government paid for the research that led to its creation. The government gave a grant that led to the development of the algorithms behind Google, but there's no public interest requirement in their use.
So I have a question then, and this may sound naive of me, but if there have been so many laws, regulations, licensing, whatever you want to call it, throughout the decades now to help both bolster free speech, meaning to support the First Amendment, to support journalists, but at the same time kind of regulate everything so it's not the wild, wild west, why has everything with the internet been like completely the opposite? Because as we're on the brink of moving from Web 2.0, which is like the social media phase, to Web 3.0, which is going to be like AI, metaverses, and things like that, we're lagging behind in so many kind of laws, and not just the media to support the First Amendment, but I'm talking about intellectual property, copyright. As a legal expert, I know you know. So why are we dragging our feet so much with them?
So some great questions. There's, again, many, many different explanations. One is, this is the innovative society. It's pro-innovation, pro-business, and there's a reluctance to develop regulation before there's an urgent need because of the fears that that will quash innovation. And unlike Europe, where there's an attitude of guarding against risk even before it happens. It even has a name. It's called the precautionary principle. And you see, therefore, the European Union has a Data Privacy Protection Act. We don't have one in the United States. We have some states that are now trying to do something like that. The European Union is very close to adopting an AI Act. We don't have one. Although the White House issued a kind of guidance about that, but it's not a law. So that's one reason. Another reason is the First Amendment and all the traditions around it, with this idea that, government better stay pretty clear and far away from anything that looks like media. Again, with broadcasting, the justification was the scarcity of the airwaves. But government has not regulated newspapers. And in fact, that was a point of pride since the Revolution. Back in the 17th century, England regulated newspapers. They had to have licenses. It was part of the revolution to say, we're not doing that, First Amendment. And of course, the revolutionary founding fathers were grateful for the power of the press that helped to lead support for the revolution first and then for the Constitution afterwards. I think another reason is that it's just hard to figure out what the rules should be. If you want to have a robust and free debate, what role should the government have? I mean, even these questions that are pending right now in the courts, if a politician uses a social media site to communicate with constituents and then blocks someone, is that a violation of the First Amendment? Is that politician acting as a government official in a way that they now are restricted? We don't know the answer yet. We'll see what the courts say. So they're hard questions.
Sorry to throw so many at you so fast in the one
No, it's
thing, but
fine.
it's it's just one of those things to me where I'm like, even if it isn't necessarily like restrictive laws, what I'm saying is there were things in your earlier examples that were more supportive and
That
to
is true.
bolster. And so even the more like positive elements, like I just feel
Yes.
like I don't see it as much with the internet. It's still very much like wild, wild west. And then
That's
when no, look,
really, that is true. And that is one of my causes in the writing the
right,
book, is to say the government can be supportive. Public
right.
media is the closest. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I am on the board of WGBH, which is the
Mhm.
producer of a quarter of the content of public media. But it's a tiny percentage of support that comes from the federal government. The vast majority comes from ordinary people. And some from foundations, but and
Right.
that's different again than other countries that have public media, like
Mhm.
in the BBC in England. It's funded by the government. Japan, public media funded by the government.
Right. So going back in time just a little bit, you talk quite a bit in your book for a little while about the golden age of journalism. And would you be willing to explain to everyone tonight what the golden age of journalism was, and in your opinion, what the first cracks were at the end of this age?
So I don't want to overemphasize it was never perfect, but starting in the late 1950s through the late 70s, there was what many people have called a golden age, particularly in broadcasting, but also in some newspapers, in the following respects. Journalists were respected. There was enough of a business model success so that there were revenues allowing the journalists to actually be high-minded and to try to aspire to higher and higher quality and to compete over quality. The ideal of objectivity didn't really emerge in American journalism until the turn of the 20th century. And then we had a period known as yellow journalism, and a period in which political parties, this is really 19th century, paid for journalism. But around the 1960s to 80s, there was enough revenues that you had people like Walter Cronkite, who were revered as being a voice not just of authority but of wisdom, and when there were national disasters, bringing the country together. The fact that there were really only 2.5 national broadcasting companies, it meant people were watching the same thing, had the same experiences. It kind of built a common community. Uh, but here are the ways in which it was not good. It was, largely exclusionary white men. Only some communities were covered. There were many communities that were never given the attention that they deserve. There was a separate Black press that developed really since the 20s and continued through that period. You had great magazines like Ebony, but it didn't break into the mainstream dominant news very much. What were the cracks, though, that led to the changes? Well, I think that in one interesting change was a challenge to one of those public interest features in the regulation of media. The fairness doctrine was a specific rule adopted by the Federal Communications Commission to make sure that when political subjects were covered, that there was opportunity for competing views from different points of view. And a lot of people didn't like it, particularly some of the leaders and the politicians didn't like it, and it lapsed. So it was never rejected. It was, in fact, upheld by the courts as lawful, but politically it died. And that really led to talk radio and to Fox News and, frankly, to MSNBC and to media outlets that don't even pretend to have competing points of view. I think that's part of the downward spiral.
I have seen op-eds and other pieces where people have discussed the fairness doctrine and have asked for or requested or opined for it to come back in some capacity, whether both again for the television or even a version on the internet. Now, I've also seen other people though who say, but what happened with the fairness doctrine was instead of going there, we just don't go there. We won't touch that topic because we just don't want to handle it. What are your views? Is there a way to have a fairness doctrine? Because I think these cracks led to a very fast polarization where people, it's almost like sports teams. We have our sides, we stick to it. We only read, like, I only read Fox News, I only read the Times. And it's like there are less and less people that are willing to read all of the different papers and come to their own conclusions.
Well, I'm very worried about that, and I'm worried about the polarization. I mean, even in the 19th century, when there were political parties funding newspapers, most people tended to get more than one newspaper. People actually did encounter the different views. I do think the trend that you're describing is just completely compounded, exacerbated by the internet, where it's narrowcasting, echo bubbles, the filter bubble it's been called, where the algorithms determine what it is that I've looked at before and then give me more of that. I'm very interested in technologically, how could something be designed that does what the fairness doctrine did? And you could have a private company just choose to offer it as an option. So what do I mean? I mean, it could actually catalog content. And so when I'm looking at something, it could give me the option. Do you want to see someone who has a different point of view on the same subject? And the reason I know that this is possible is that a group of students at University of Chicago, for a class project, developed something they called Flipside that did just that and used an algorithm and content analysis to tag content. And they did it in one semester. Now, I'm sure that the students at the University of Chicago are very talented, but if they could do something like that in one semester, I have a feeling that the engineers at Meta and all these other platforms could come up with something even better. One of the good ideas, I know we're not talking about solutions yet, but one of the good ideas that I think is really worth talking about, developed since I wrote the book, is why not require these big platform companies to allow competition over the curation so that people could choose, and at least to see with transparency why they're getting what they're getting, and to have a kind of record of their diet and be asked, you want to see something different? Why is this not happening? Well, the legal justification for the fairness doctrine was scarcity, those scarce airwaves. And we don't have that with the internet. So the rationale for requiring private companies to show different points of view would run smack dab into the editorial freedom and their First Amendment rights.
Right.
So that's a problem.
Right. I just wonder if the flip side would have any type of argument, though. Again, no legal expert, but there comes a point though where when you have so many options, the big data argument, that really you don't have anything. It's like when people turn on Netflix and they scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll, and they'll spend like a whole half an hour just scrolling through all the thumbnails of television shows because there's so many options, they don't know where to settle. And in the end, they watch nothing, right? So to me, I wonder like if there's a possibility that an argument that there's so much that certain voices, certain perspectives are getting buried in the mess that, there could be something to support various sides or voices that way.
I know that you were right. The New Yorker had a great cartoon that showed someone just clicking with the remote control at TV saying thousands of channels and nothing to watch. There's a very good book by a social scientist called The Paradox of Choice that shows that if we're given 3 options, like at the supermarket where we can choose free samples of 3 different kinds of cheese, we'll buy one of them. If we're given more than 5, we won't buy one. We're overwhelmed by choice. So that's real. I think that now we're getting bundlers or advisors who will guide you. If you like this, you can watch that. But it's not, it is a kind of Wild West, and it's kind of crazy. So I like the idea of inviting, the Parent Teachers Association to be a curator, inviting, the Catholic Church can be a curator. Let's just compete over curation.
I think that's a great idea. Let everyone be able to create collections, and I think the competition will make more voices be heard. But this is a great question, I think, going into, you were talking about the golden age of journalism. You have 2.5 broadcast stations. It's very clear what is a journalist, what is news. In 2024, journalism could be so much. We have YouTubers that are like on the ground reporting whenever there's protests. We have people who have paywall subscriptions, but they're like hybrid comedians slash pundits slash news reporters. There's so many different, it's almost like chameleon like. Like, how do you define a journalist in the media now?
Oh boy, you're asking the easy ones now. No, that's a really hard question. And it's a live one because there's a bill pending in Congress to give subsidies to local media. For example, if they hire a local journalist, and who counts is a genuine unanswered question. When California created its constitution and had something in it that's like a parallel to the First Amendment, they tried to specify who's covered, but it was written before the internet, so bloggers are not there. And there's litigation about that. The White House has had that as an issue. Who gets admitted to the press conferences at the White House? So these are genuine questions. Who has press credentials? And I don't know the answer. I think it's a really good question.
Right. I just think it's something that has to be defined, though, especially if a few of your solutions, such as like reimbursement of journalists or publishers, like we'll talk about that in a little bit, would ever come to fruition. We would have to have a real clear definition of a journalist, or so many people are going to put on their journalist hat, and they're not necessarily journalists, or for fraud and abuse.
No, it's a genuine problem. I think there might be ways to handle it, but there are certainly unscrupulous people who will try to take advantage of that.
Right. And you kind of mentioned bloggers, and this is similar. I'm not sure how familiar or how much you follow Substack. But for those of you in the audience tonight that aren't sure, so Substack is a popular newsletter subscription platform. It's really exploded since about 2021. And many of the most popular journalists that are on there have former connections to traditional news media, such as former New York Times reporters, things like that have either left on their own or have been let go due to cuts in staffing departments and newsrooms, since everything has really fissured. My only thought, though, is that each of these journalists, they have like a subscription fee where you have to pay for just this one particular journalist. And while that can still continue to support investigative journalism, there's with all these like microtransactions, because a lot of them range from like $8 to $10 just for one journalist. Does this further contribute to like the siloing of our views by putting these things behind such strict paywalls that you can only really afford so many of these types of subscriptions?
The paywall issue is part of the dilemma for streaming content generally, and for the internet, any ability to have, again, reinvestment in the development of content rather than have garbage or made up stuff, or hallucinations by generative AI. One of the features of the internet generally is what economists call unbundling. So things that used to come together, you can now get them one at a time. This is certainly true for media. To think about it, a newspaper would combine your crossword puzzle, your weather, your sports, your recipes, your political coverage. Now you can get each of those separately. And so there's no cross subsidy anymore. Many of the journalists who I think very highly of, I've always liked, have now Substack subscriptions, and I want to follow them. I can't say that many are doing investigative journalism. It's mostly opinions. But the business model to reinvest in journalism, particularly investigative journalism, is broken. The siloing is part of it, but just even reimbursing it is hard. And one of the, some of the blame has to go to the established media because they were late to understand the digital revolution and initially gave away free content. And a lot of people got used to not paying for news. And since people can often get it posted on their social media site, particularly people who are your generation and younger are not experienced with paying to get news. And if you even had a broadcast background, you could just turn on the radio and get it for free because it was supported by ads. The economists have estimated it would cost about as much as people spend on a cup of coffee to actually pay for a subscription for news, but there isn't a developed appetite for it.
That's a shame. I personally, as you said, like I subscribe to, I think, 5 different journalists that I really support. I think it's really important. And it's necessary, especially to continue having different views, different opinions, especially things that aren't talked about. Now, I want to kind of pivot just a little bit. And I don't want this to be controversial, but we already had one person in the Q&A kind of ask this. And again, it deals with the polarization. Now, one of the big pushes behind the decline in media, often cited in op-eds and news articles, is the overall trust by the readership. So
Yeah.
many people now just do not trust the news, or they do not trust specific news organizations. Now, with the fairness doctrine, you said that that kind of like caused the first cracks that started like conservative radio, that then led to cable news channels that were obviously dedicated to a specific view. But furthermore than that, I feel that this decline has happened much more rapidly than the 90s when this was like first coming about. It's been much more rapid. Um, and so why do you think this is happening so much? And is there any place, because again, you're kind of talking about the Constitution and if there's a role to assist and bolster. So is there any room or any role in Congress to assist in supporting news to help build their reputations back up? Or is this something that networks and papers themselves have to do? And if so, how?
Well, when we were talking earlier about the golden age, and I say that in quotes, again, it was a period when media was making a lot of money. And that led to this kind of high-minded public service attitude. Money and the desire for money has actually led in a different direction in more recent years. So when Roger Ailes lost his job, he was actually approached by Rupert Murdoch to get advice. Murdoch was thinking about starting his own network and had a business plan for it and showed it to Roger Ailes, and Roger Ailes didn't like it. He said, why? He said, well, you're just copying what the other broadcasters are doing, and they're already competing for a dwindling audience. You should instead decide you're not going after everybody and go after only the people who have one point of view. And Rupert Murdoch said, can I make money that way? And Roger Ailes said, you can make more money that way. Well, he turned out to be right. And Fox News has become, where more people in the United States get their news, if you want to talk about an actual news organization, than anywhere else. What it contributed to that, I don't know. It's kind of a global phenomenon because Murdoch did that first in Australia, then he went to here and into England. There's certainly similar phenomenon going on in India. It's larger than the topic we're discussing is what has led to the tribalism in the world. Some people think it has something to do with globalization, the increased global trade and global cultural phenomenon, and more people feeling unmoored, jobs being lost, feeling like a need to belong to something. And media is one of the ways that people can both identify with a group and have that reinforced. Other explanations for the tribalism and the polarization is it's a very scary time in the world, and to have just reassurances about more simple truths can be more comforting than to see, oh, there are multiple points of view. But it's a complicated question. It has economic, political, psychological, dimensions for sure.
Right. And I mean, there are even dimensions in the newsrooms themselves.
Yes.
So without getting too deep in the weeds, but like in December, there was a very large article in The Economist by the former New York Times editorial page editor, James Bennett. He wrote like this massive article regarding the choice or the backlash for choosing to publish an op-ed. And then by the newsroom, and he accuses the New York Times staff of kind of just catering to their political ideologies instead of necessarily what he thought that the New York Times was, which was more of like a open political discussion. So I just thought that that article had like a lot of discussion, and it was picked up by a lot of sources like Politico and things like that. I saw that we're also analyzing it. Do you feel that, obviously, like we were talking just now about cable news, but do you feel that this kind of siloing is also really heavily happening with the physical papers as well, like as this former editor had explained?
Well, I'm sure it has to some extent, although the Wall Street Journal tries to have varied views and the New York Times tries to have varied views. Not very many, but it tries to have at least a columnist who is, quote, more conservative. The story that you're describing, though, matches something that I see in other sectors, in workplaces, in law firms, and certainly on university and college campuses, which is something happened in the last 15, 20 years where younger people don't want to be in the presence of views that they don't like. And protesting speakers on college campuses is one example. I don't understand it fully. Free speech was, something I really care about. But I think we don't teach civics the way that we once did. And also the experience people have on social media, being able to be surrounded by views that agree with one another. I don't know. I can't quite explain it. I'd love to understand it better, but it is a bigger phenomenon. And the story that you're describing in the New York Times really came from the reporters who didn't want this piece published. It wasn't from the top down. It was the bottom up.
Right. And I really try to not put my own like my own personal bias when I moderate an author discussion, but I really do urge that people watch and read all sides. Like, even if it's like hate watching, hate listening, or what people call that, like, I really think you should. I have a podcast doc with like 50 different podcasts, all the way from the extreme left to the extreme right. And it's the only way I feel that you yourself come to your conclusions. You have to listen to multiple viewpoints.
Well, I love that. I totally agree with it. And again, I think that we could ask media platforms to help us. At least
Right.
let us see what we're seeing. At least make it easy for us.
Right. So I thought we can now pivot and talk about some solutions, because the first one I really want to talk about is media literacy. So we talk about digital literacy, financial literacy. I think we really need media literacy so that people have the ability to read, comprehend, and understand if an article is fake, dangerous, or containing misinformation, or even worse, containing AI, because AI is proliferated with photos. We could do AI voice now, videos. I really think that's important. And it's not just from a K to 12 where like just the primary schools deal with this, because adults really need this help. How can the government provide that type of support? What type of institutions should be providing media literacy for adults?
Well, I totally agree. It's one of my recommendations. I think that there are examples of some courses offered K through 12 and in college. I certainly think libraries can play a big role in public education events. We're living through one of the major transformations of human experience with the internet. We should just acknowledge it. It's on the order of the creation of the book. And one of the things that the creation of the book did is it allowed access to the Bible and to all kinds of information to people who previously could not afford it. What happened were revolutions all over the world as a result. dramatic transformations in politics, economics, people's ways of life. We're living through something like that. And so we need help, and we need places to talk about it. And we certainly need ways to learn how to discern when we're getting some input. Is it a human being that gave it to us? Is it reliable in any way? One of the great things about the internet is that there's no intermediary between the content and the user, the reader. And one of the terrible things about the internet is that there's no intermediary between the content, the creator, and the user. There's no editor anymore. It's an algorithm instead that is just using criteria like, can we maximize attention? So we all need to understand how to make sense or reject what it is that we're getting. I do think that it's part of a larger requirement of more focus on facts and the difference between facts and opinion. So again, great historic moment, the development of the Enlightenment, the idea that there's a difference between magic and facts, or fantasy and facts, and the development of science, the scientific revolution. It's in jeopardy right now. People don't believe science. People don't believe what doctors tell them. And some of it is this flattening of media sources, information sources. My neighbor told me, no, I shouldn't take a vitamin, or because it's not healthy. Well, is that more reliable? No, but there are reasons, and I understand it, for people to have skepticism about those who've been identified as experts. So I think that more education about how do we interrogate what we're receiving altogether to know, is this supported by evidence? Is there logic in the analysis? Or is this repeating an opinion over and over and over again?
Right. And like I said, I just think especially with AI, it's improving so quickly. Like the most original, when it first really hit the market with AI photos and stuff like that, they were so rudimentary. Now you can easily recapture stuff that looks very lifelike. And unless you're really closely looking, you can completely be fooled about it.
Oh, you probably can't even then. There's
Right.
an arms race to develop the software that can detect a deep fake, and the deep fakes are winning.
Right.
Because they outgun those that are trying to come up with the detection methods. So here's where I think regulation would be helpful. I think there should be an obligation to disclose that some content was created, how it was created, and even what were the dominant sources. The scandal that recently came out with Sports Illustrated, that some of their content was being created by AI. I'm not against it, but the reader should be allowed to know.
Right, absolutely. And then now they've unfortunately have completely almost shuttered most of their operations, which that's huge because that's a major cultural cornerstone in American life. So that's really sad.
Really sad. Really sad.
Now, obviously there are 12 in your book, 12 solutions that you have. Obviously, you would need to use multiple solutions to be able to curtail the issues. One solution alone would not be enough. I don't want to give all your solutions away. I really want people to read this book so that they can really soak in and understand the complexity of this situation. But what are a couple of the more easily doable ones that you think we can actually do within the next couple of years?
Well, thank you so much for plugging the book, and also, really understanding one of my major points is there's no silver bullet. There's no single solution here. It's a complex set of forces got us to where we are. But I think there's three categories of recommendations that I'm making. One is to treat the platform companies as if they were responsible adult companies. Just as an example, right now, they are given an immunity that's not given to a newspaper. It's not given to a broadcast channel, and they're immune from lawsuits under the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It was created by Congress at a time that the internet was just starting, and the hope was to insulate fledgling companies from the dangers of being sued for misinformation, for fraud, or what have you. Well, these are not fledgling companies. These are some of the highest capitalized companies in the history of the planet. They shouldn't be immune. And similarly, I think that they should have to pay for the intellectual property that they are circulating without paying for it. And a second category is to protect the readers and the consumers, whether it's using existing laws with regard to fraud or consumer protection, requiring disclosures about where a post comes from, what's generated by AI. We've talked a bit about requiring transparency of the curation rules, disclosure of that nature. A bolder idea here is to treat the platform companies as if they were public utilities, the same way with the electric company or the water company, so that they're still private and there's investors and the investors get money in return for their investment, but there are duties that attach because these are such significant resources. And the third category is to amplify reliable sources of information and the discernment by readers and consumers, as we were just talking about media education. But more amplification could come also with tax benefits, for example, to those who hire a locally based journalist, or those who buy advertising in a local outlet or subscribe to journalism. And amplify reliable sources by actually some technical rules, revise the Copyright Act's treatment of public media so that they can be able to compete in the new distribution platforms. Something I know from my own experience, for example, Frontline is a documentary series that's produced by WGBH Public Media here in Boston, does great documentaries. We get more views through YouTube than we do through, broadcast or even just internet-based our site. But YouTube has no obligation, and therefore it does not share with the public media all the information that it's gathering, all its data analytics, and it doesn't share any revenues, of course, and it doesn't even commit to showing the names of the sponsors. Public media has been able to raise money in part by having sponsors, but they're cut off when it's on YouTube. So you could have a law that just requires that, so that, again, there's even playing field for public media and that kind of investment. A kind of bolder one is to tax the big media platforms and take the revenues and reinvest them in public media, in independent media sources.
Mm-hmm. Right. I know one that personally that really bothers me, just from as reader, a user of the internet, is I really do not like, and I don't understand why so many people believe social media is truly free. It's not. There's a cost behind that, and it's your personal data. And the amount of things that they're selling with your data without your consent, and the amount of people who know, things about you that really are none of their business to be knowing about, that really concerns me. And I think another thing too with this, kind of like, it's kind of tangentially related, but I do think that there should be more regulation about what companies are and are not allowed to be doing with your data.
Well, I really am taken myself with the phrase that if you're getting a product for free, then you probably are the product. And that is the case with social media. It is what we're leaving behind, our personal data, that is the gold mine. It's the new gold rush. I do think I don't want to glorify the past and imagine it was always great. But I see that there's one question in the chat suggesting that only elites read newspapers in the earlier periods in the United States. In fact, literacy rates were so high in the United States compared with Europe, much higher. And the circulation of papers, much higher than than Europe, than Canada. So that was an important part of the founding of this country and of the development of democracy. It's certainly not everybody, but much higher percentage-wise than it was elsewhere. And that's a distinctive tradition in the United States that's in jeopardy right now.
Right. I think this is a really good question. Someone wants to know more about the FCC. Didn't the FCC have rules of conduct that had to be met by the 3 TV news stations. What role did President Clinton at the end of his second term do in decreasing the authority of the FCC?
A really interesting question, and I, with pride will disclose that my father was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission under President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. So in some sense, I am reflecting conversations of my lifetime on this subject. And my father wrote the introduction to my book, the preface, and it is the best part of the book. He's no longer with us, but that was a real treasure for me to have his participation in this project. The Federal Communications Commission had indeed rules that had public service requirements for the broadcasters, and they have basically been eliminated, not just from President Clinton, but from subsequent presidents. We talked about the fairness doctrine, let go under the Reagan administration. The rise of cable maybe has more to do with this, that the broadcaster said it's unfair for us to have these obligations when cable doesn't have the same degree of obligations. And also that the justification for regulation was scarcity, and now there's so much choice. I'm interested in markets. I like free markets. I'm interested in that it took public broadcasting's commitment to children to develop Sesame Street. But once it did, it showed that there was a market. And Sesame Street is now on commercial outlets, and it's not developed by public media. I think showing market failures and that there is a possibility of creating a market is one of the great services that government subsidies can accomplish. And that's true with public media. It's been true about entertainment and education on public media, showing that people are interested, and now others provide it. And I think that keeping that as a wellspring of innovation would be a good idea. But recent administrations have cut back on the support for public media.
Now, obviously, you're not a fortune teller, but someone does want to know, lacking government intervention, where will news reporting and sources be in maybe a year, 5 years, or 10?
There's a writer whose name is Faith Popcorn, who says that she can predict the future as far as she can throw her crystal ball. So I can't even predict it that far. But based on the Medill School of Journalism's estimates, we are likely to lose, if the trends continue, lose another 3,000 to 5,000 news outlets in the next year. And if it continues at that rate, we will not have journalists. It just won't happen. It won't exist in 10 years from now. I really worry about that. I hope I'm wrong. And as part of the MacArthur Foundation, which, as you said in your introduction, I have the good fortune to chair, that is one of now 25 large philanthropies that have come together, made a commitment, and raised $500 million to invest in local news. And now is working on raising a second half, so we get up to a total $1 billion, by working with local communities, local, like the Cleveland Foundation, local philanthropies, to make commitments to local communities. And, there are little green shoots that are happening. And some of them are even addressing the longstanding problems of communities that were never covered by journalism. So we have micro presses, microjournalism, people writing about the news in their own communities. And I hope that a combination of philanthropy, subscriptions, maybe commercial investments, others will actually revive news, but it won't look the same way that it did in the past. It can't. Interestingly, there's bipartisan support in Congress for several of the recommendations that I have indicated. And we shouldn't be surprised, no matter what your political party is, if you're a candidate or you're in elected office, you need the news. And for those who have a somewhat higher minded than their own self-interest approach, if we don't have news, it's pretty clear that when news reporting disappears from a community, public corruption increases, private corruption increases, voting decreases.
Makes sense. People are less engaged with their community. That can lead to apathy.
That's
Um,
correct.
and so I know you just mentioned some solutions, kind of like with some philanthropy and stuff like that, but I want to go back to local newspapers, and because I think this is a great question. Specifically, because I just listened to you yesterday, WBUR had a fantastic segment because for those of you in the chat who don't know, there were tons of people laid off in the last 2 weeks for big, not little, but big presses, including the LA Times. And so there was a news article explaining how even for those, it's creating news deserts for specific communities. And they said that 5 newspapers are closing every 2 weeks. And so that to me is a crisis, a legit crisis. And so how can we really start working to save local newspapers? If we have an interest, should we be petitioning our lawmakers? What should we be doing?
Great question. The loss of even a big paper like LA Times, Miami Herald, someone explained it to me, it's like the tent pole that holds up a whole ecosystem. And so we don't even know all the repercussions. One thing that you can do is that you can subscribe to a paper, you can support local media. You can support legislation of the sort like the local news sustainability act that has bipartisan support, and there are versions of it that are now working their way through state legislatures as well. That's what gives tax breaks to people who subscribe to a paper or to a paper that hires a new journalist locally. You can also look up the phrase Press Forward, which is this coalition of philanthropies that I mentioned, and they are working now in local communities as well to support new innovative individual outlets and also new models, so that, for example, some of the costs of back office distribution can be shared across different outlets. So creating some new structures, the way that the Associated Press was a new structure at one point, so that individual papers couldn't afford to have a journalist in Vietnam, but they could pool their money and have a journalist through the Associated Press. There's similar efforts of working together. So there are lots of things to do. But actually speaking out that you care about this is a very good place to start.
And for those of you interested, that would be pressforward.news. I just pulled it up out of curiosity while you were speaking about that. And they have a lot of very useful information about their mission and their purpose and what they're doing. So I think that sounds like a really great place to start if you truly want to do something to try and support and save your news. And also, I would also say if grassroots start popping up in like replacement, if you lose your paper, but someone starts a blog and they're really at it and they're accepting volunteers, volunteer, get involved, support your paper in some way. We lost one in my town, but we have like a digital one that covers the whole county, and it's donations based, whatever you're willing and able to pay. Like, I just think it's really important to support journalists, especially local journalism, because if you lose that, you have no idea what's going on in your town.
Right.
So
I'll tell you, when Flint, Michigan had its crisis of lead in the waters, I had the chance to meet with the public health official who blew the whistle. And she scared the bejesus out of me because she said there are hundreds of Flint, Michigans in America. And I said, how come we don't know? She said, we were lucky. We had journalism.
wow. Yeah. Well, Martha, we are nearing 8 o'clock and the library's closing. I wish we had more time because this has been a really thoughtful discussion. I thank you so much for this. I encourage everyone. It's a short book, but it is dense. And it really looks at the issue from a legal perspective, which again, I'm not a legal expert, so I appreciate seeing what we can do and what maybe we should really start thinking about doing, because I'm a big believer of the First Amendment and we really need to support the ability to speak. So thank you, Martha.
Thank you for the wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those who want to continue following, because you have such a CV, you are publishing things like crazy. How can people continue following you and what you're doing?
Oh, goodness. You can write me, you can find me at Harvard Law School. It's minow@law.harvard.edu. That's very kind of you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the thoughtful questions in the Q&A, and I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.